Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're exploring one of the fastest growing frontiers in biopharma, the rise of biosimilars 2.0. These next generation competitors are shaking up markets, challenging pricing models, and forcing companies to rethink innovation strategies.
That's right. Biosimilars were once considered niche players, but now they're hitting blockbuster biologics and carving out major market share. In the US alone, biosimilars are projected to save the healthcare system more than $180 billion over the next 5 years, according to IQVIA. Globally, they're expected to account for nearly a third of all biologic spending by the end of this decade.
And to help us unpack all of this, we're excited to welcome a guest today, Brittany Collins. Brittany is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at a global biopharmaceutical company where she leads biosimilar strategy and global submissions. She's been at the front lines of navigating FDA approvals, EMA frameworks, and payer adoption strategies. Brittany, we welcome you to the deep dive.
Thanks so much, Anna and Eric. I'm thrilled to be here. Biosimilars are such a fascinating space right now because we're not just talking about copycats anymore. We're talking about sophisticated, highly competitive products that require deep science, rigorous regulatory work, and smart commercialization strategies.
Welcome, Brittany. Happy to have you here with us today. Let's start with the basics. When we say biosimilars 2.0, what exactly do we mean?
Great question. The first wave of biosimilars, what I'd call biosimilars 1.0, were mostly focused on getting into the market once patents expired on the early blockbuster biologics like apoetins, filgrastim, and some monoclonal antibodies. It was a race to show comparability and drive down costs. Biosimilars 2.0, though, is different. We're now seeing products that are entering crowded markets with multiple competitors, targeting very complex biologics like adalimumab and bevacizumab. Companies are no longer just proving similarity, they're innovating in how they manufacture, how they demonstrate interchangeability, and even how they package and deliver these therapies to patients.
That's such an important point because when biosimilars first came on the scene, a lot of people thought they'd just follow the generic drug model, but it's much more complicated, right?
Exactly. Unlike generics, biosimilars aren't chemically identical to the originator. They're highly similar with no clinically meaningful differences. That means you need advanced analytics, robust comparability studies, and often global regulatory strategies to demonstrate confidence. And that makes development far more expensive. Usually between $100 to $300 million per biosimilar compared to just a few million for a generic.
And yet the competition is fierce. Look at Humira, the world's top-selling drug. In 2023, we saw 9 biosimilars launch in the US against it. That's unprecedented.
And what's even more interesting is how companies are competing. Some are focusing on aggressive pricing, others on patient support programs, and still others on delivery devices that improve the patient experience. That's why I say this is biosimilars 2.0. Because success is no longer just about being first to file, it's about differentiation in a crowded marketplace.
Let's talk regulation for a minute. The FDA, EMA, and other global regulators have been adapting to keep pace. Brittany, how do you see the regulatory environment evolving for biosimilars?
We've come a long way. In the US, the FDA has really leaned into the interchangeability pathway, which allows certain biosimilars to be substituted for the reference product at the pharmacy level. This is similar to generics. That's a game changer for uptake. In Europe, biosimilars have had stronger adoption for years, partly because the EMA has issued very clear guidance and health systems are structured to promote their use. But here's the big challenge with 2.0. Regulators are asking more nuanced questions. It's not enough to show similarity. They want to see manufacturing consistency at scale, real-world evidence on interchangeability, and robust pharmacovigilance plans to monitor long-term safety.
So the bar is rising.
Absolutely, and that's why companies with strong regulatory and quality systems have a competitive advantage. It's not just about filing a dossier, it's about demonstrating confidence across the product's entire life cycle.
That ties perfectly into manufacturing. Eric, you've done some research on this. What are some of the key hurdles biosimilars face on the production side?
One of the biggest challenges is scale up. Producing a monoclonal antibody biosimilar, for instance, requires massive bioreactors, precise cell culture conditions, and consistency across every batch. Even a tiny deviation can cause regulators to question comparability. And with biosimilars 2.0, where competition is fierce, there's pressure to not only scale but also reduce cost of goods without sacrificing quality.
Exactly. And this is where advanced manufacturing technologies, things like continuous manufacturing, digital twins, and process automation, are starting to play a big role. The companies that can adopt these technologies while staying aligned with regulatory expectations will be the ones that thrive.
So we're at a turning point. Biosimilars are no longer just cheaper versions of biologics. They're becoming a space where science, regulation, and business strategy all collide.
And that's what makes this conversation so exciting. Because the way companies navigate this next wave will shape not just competition, but access to life-saving treatments around the world. Let's shift into one of the most hotly debated areas of biosimilars, reimbursement and payer adoption. Because even if you get regulatory approval and you have a strong manufacturing process, the real battle is whether payers and providers actually use your product.
Exactly. And Brittany, I know you've had a front row seat to some of those challenges. What are you seeing?
You're absolutely right. Market access is the battlefield. In the US, payers and pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, often dictate which products make it onto formularies. For biosimilars, that can mean aggressive rebate wars. We've seen situations where the reference product actually maintains dominance despite biosimilar competition, simply because of contract exclusivity or deeper discounts.
That's wild. You'd think lower cost automatically equals greater uptake.
It's not that simple. For example, Humira biosimilars launched in 2023, and despite multiple entrants, the reference product still held a huge share well into the year. Payers were slow to shift formularies because AbbVie offered aggressive rebate structures. It shows that economics, not just science, drives adoption.
And outside the US, things look very different. In Europe, biosimilars are often embraced much more quickly. Uptake rates for some biologics exceed 80% within a couple of years of biosimilar entry. So it makes me wonder, why is the US lagging?
It really comes down to system design. Europe's single payer or national health systems can mandate switches to biosimilars. In the US, the system is fragmented. Hospitals, insurers, PBMs, and providers each have different incentives. That slows adoption and makes it less predictable for manufacturers.
That unpredictability must make business planning tough.
Absolutely. Companies have to factor in not just whether their biosimilar will get approved, but whether it will get used. That's why support services, things like patient hubs, education for prescribers, and assistance programs are becoming just as important as the molecule itself.
And I think that leads into patient trust. Biologics are often life-saving therapies, and some patients are nervous about switching to a biosimilar. What would you say would be a way for us to address that?
Education is key. Surveys have shown that a significant portion of patients don't understand what biosimilars are. Some fear they're cheap knockoffs, when in reality they undergo rigorous comparability testing to prove safety and efficacy. Physicians play a huge role here. If providers are confident, patients are far more likely to accept a switch.
So it's about building confidence across the entire chain: regulators, providers, payers, and patients.
Exactly. And this is where interchangeability designations in the US become so important. If a biosimilar is deemed interchangeable, it can be substituted at the pharmacy without the prescriber's approval. That not only drives adoption, but also sends a strong signal of trust from the FDA.
Let's also talk about global competition. Because biosimilars aren't just a US or European story, they're reshaping markets worldwide.
Absolutely. India, South Korea, and China are becoming major players. Korean firms, for instance, have launched biosimilars globally with impressive success. Samsung Bioepis and Celltrion are now household names in the biosimilar space. And in China, the government is heavily backing biosimilars as a way to expand access while controlling healthcare costs.
So, in a way, biosimilars are not only lowering costs, but also shifting the global competitive landscape.
Yes, and that creates both opportunity and risk. On one hand, companies from emerging markets can expand access globally. On the other hand, Western firms face tougher competition. The companies that win will be those that innovate not just in science, but in commercialization, partnerships, and global strategy.
And we haven't even touched on one of the biggest forces shaping Biosimilars 2.0, which is technology. Manufacturing advances, digital supply chain systems, even AI driven analytics are being woven into development programs.
That's right. We're already seeing companies use digital twins to simulate manufacturing processes before scaling up, which reduces risk. AI tools are being piloted to optimize cell culture conditions or predict stability profiles. These innovations can shave months off development timelines, and in a market, this competitive speed matters.
So, if Biosimilars 1.0 was about proving the science, Biosimilars 2.0 is about proving strategy.
Exactly. The science is a given now. The differentiators are cost, trust, speed, and access. That's what makes this era so dynamic.
So far, we've talked about payers, patients, and global competition, but I think we need to dive deeper into the manufacturing side because that's where biosimilars really separate themselves from small molecules. Unlike generics, you can't just copy and paste a chemical structure. Biologics are produced in living systems, which means biosimilars require extremely sophisticated manufacturing.
Right. And if anything, the stakes are even higher now than in the early days. Companies aren't just proving they can replicate the reference biologic, they're proving they can do it at scale, with consistent quality, and at a cost that makes the biosimilar viable.
Exactly. Manufacturing is one of the biggest barriers to entry. A single biosimilar facility can cost upwards of $500 million to build and validate. And once it's running, companies need to maintain strict controls, cell line stability, contamination risks, supply chain security. Any deviation can compromise the entire batch. That's why we've seen consolidation in this space, because only well capitalized players can really compete.
And when you think about it, this is why Biosimilars 2.0 is so fascinating. Companies aren't just duplicating, they're innovating in how they manufacture. Continuous bioprocessing, single use technologies, and modular facilities are helping reduce costs and improve flexibility.
That's a great point. Continuous manufacturing, for example, has been a big buzzword in the industry. Instead of producing biologics in large, discrete batches, companies can run a steady, ongoing process that's easier to control and less wasteful.
And regulators are starting to support this shift. The FDA and EMA have issued guidance encouraging continuous bioprocessing, and we're seeing real world adoption. The benefit is not just efficiency, but resilience. If you can flex your manufacturing capacity quickly, you're better positioned to respond to demand spikes, like what we saw during the pandemic.
That ties into another major issue: supply chain resilience. During COVID-19, we saw just how fragile global supply chains can be. For biosimilars, which often require specialized inputs like resins, cell media, or single use components, disruptions can be devastating.
Yeah, and this isn't just about pandemics. Geopolitical tensions, export restrictions, and even natural disasters can all impact access to critical raw materials. Companies that rely on a single supplier for a key input are putting themselves at serious risk.
Which is why we're seeing more emphasis on supply chain diversification and reshoring. In fact, some governments are incentivizing local biomanufacturing to reduce reliance on imports. The US has made funding announcements to strengthen domestic biologics manufacturing, and Europe has similar initiatives under its pharmaceutical strategy.
That's an interesting shift. Biosimilars as part of national healthcare security. It shows how important they've become, not just for patient access, but for system wide resilience.
And let's not forget sustainability. As the life sciences industry faces more pressure to meet environmental, social, and governance (ESG) goals, biosimilar manufacturers are being pushed to adopt greener technologies. Single-use plastics in biomanufacturing are under scrutiny, and companies are exploring more sustainable alternatives.
Sustainability isn't just a PR move either, it can be a differentiator. If you can produce biosimilars with a lower carbon footprint, you're more attractive to payers and health systems that are embedding ESG metrics into procurement decisions.
That's such a good point. So when we say biosimilars 2.0, it's not just about the drugs, it's about the ecosystem, advanced manufacturing, resilient supply chains, sustainable operations, and global competitiveness.
And it's about speed too. Companies that can master these elements are the ones who will thrive, because the next decade of biosimilar competition isn't going to be about if you can make the drug. It's about how fast, how reliably, and how sustainably you can deliver it. So far, we've talked manufacturing, supply chains, and sustainability. But let's be honest, the real battleground for Biosimilars 2.0 is going to be competition models and pricing. Because at the end of the day, access and adoption often come down to dollars.
Right. When biosimilars first came to market, the assumption was they'd follow the same pattern as generics: steep price drops, rapid uptake, game over for the brand. But the reality has been more complicated.
Exactly. Unlike generics, where you might see price cuts of 80 to 90%, biosimilars tend to launch at just 15 to 30% below the reference biologic. That's because the cost of development is so much higher and there are fewer players in the market. So instead of a quick race to the bottom, you get more measured competition.
But that's changing. In markets like Europe, where policy frameworks are more aggressive, like tendering systems, you do see sharper price erosion. In Denmark, for instance, infliximab biosimilars led to price cuts of over 60% within the first year. The US has been slower, but Medicare policy changes are starting to move the needle.
And let's not forget the role of interchangeability. In the US, the FDA's designation allows pharmacists to substitute a biosimilar for its reference product without consulting the prescriber. That can accelerate uptake, but the process to win interchangeability is resource intensive, and not every company pursues it.
That's a great point. I worked on a project where a company debated whether to go for interchangeability or not. On one hand, the designation can open doors, especially in retail pharmacy. On the other hand, the cost of additional switching studies is high, and some companies would rather focus on payer contracting instead. It really comes down to strategy.
And speaking of strategy, payers are becoming incredibly sophisticated. They're not just looking at price anymore, they're evaluating total value. That includes manufacturing reliability, sustainability credentials, even patient support programs. A biosimilar that's 5% cheaper but has major supply risks may not be as attractive as one with higher reliability.
That brings us to Biosimilars 2.0 as part of a broader biologics future. The first wave was about monoclonal antibodies and blockbuster biologics going off patent. The next wave could extend into even more complex therapies, like long acting insulins, ophthalmology drugs, and potentially, in the long run, cell and gene therapy follow ons.
That's the wild frontier. Right now, no one's commercialized a biosimilar for a gene therapy, but the conversation is happening. How do you define similarity when the therapy itself is a viral vector or a personalized cell product? Regulators will need to develop entirely new frameworks. But the potential savings are enormous, given that some gene therapies cost over $2 million per patient.
Which raises an important question. Will biosimilars eventually evolve into biobetters instead of just copycats? We're already seeing companies add tweaks to improve dosing schedules, reduce side effects, or make administration easier. It's competition, yes, but it's also innovation.
I love that point. Biosimilars 2.0 might not just be about similarity, but about pushing the field forward. Think about subcutaneous formulations of drugs that used to be IV only or longer acting versions that reduce the treatment burden. That's not just competing, it's creating new value.
And it's worth noting that regulators are open to this evolution. The FDA and EMA have both said they welcome innovation as long as the evidence supports safety and efficacy. That's why companies need not only strong science, but strong regulatory strategies.
So if we look ahead, the competition won't just be about who can make the cheapest biosimilar. It'll be about who can make the most reliable, sustainable, patient-friendly, and globally compliant version, and maybe even improve on the original.
And that's where Biosimilars 2.0 becomes so much bigger than just cost savings. It's about reshaping the competitive landscape of biologics entirely. We've covered manufacturing and pricing, but let's shift gears. Because even if you've got a biosimilar ready to go, the real test is adoption, getting physicians, patients, and health systems on board.
Exactly, and that's where the US has been a different story compared to Europe. In Europe, physician and patient acceptance of biosimilars took off much faster. Part of that is cultural. Physicians are used to national tender systems, where payers and hospitals select one preferred product. Patients generally trust that the system is picking the safest and most cost-effective option.
Whereas in the US, it's more fragmented. You've got multiple insurers, PBMs, hospitals, and physician practices all making decisions. That means adoption is slower and depends heavily on education. Physicians want to see real world evidence, not just clinical comparability studies. And patients want reassurance that they're not being given a cheap knockoff.
Right, the perception hurdle is huge. Even though biosimilars go through rigorous comparability studies, some patients still equate biosimilar with less effective. It doesn't help when branded biologic manufacturers run campaigns that emphasize uncertainty around switching.
And switching is another sticking point. In Europe, switching studies, like the Norswitch trial for infliximab, helped prove there's no clinically meaningful difference when moving from a reference product to a biosimilar. That gave regulators and providers confidence. In the US, companies are still working hard to build that body of evidence and trust.
This is where real world data comes in. I was part of a project that used electronic health records to track patient outcomes after switching to biosimilars in oncology. The results showed no decline in efficacy or increase in safety events, which was critical for payer negotiations. That kind of data is what helps shift perceptions from this is risky to this is equivalent.
And payers are starting to incentivize switching. We're seeing step therapy models where patients start on a biosimilar unless there's a strong clinical reason for the branded drug. That's controversial in some circles, but it's driving adoption.
Globally, adoption looks different too. In markets like India and Brazil, biosimilars have been embraced more out of necessity. Lower-cost biologics mean broader access. But the regulatory frameworks can vary, and the rigor of data requirements isn't always consistent across countries. That creates challenges for multinational companies trying to launch globally.
And then there's Asia. South Korea, for example, has become a hub for biosimilar development, with companies like Samsung Bioepis leading the charge. Their domestic market is supportive and they're exporting aggressively to Europe and the US. That shifts the competitive landscape. Suddenly, you're not just competing with Pfizer or Amgen, but with fast moving players out of Asia.
That's such a good point. Biosimilars 2.0 isn't just about competing with the original biologics anymore. It's also about biosimilar versus biosimilar competition. Once multiple biosimilars for the same product hit the market, the dynamics change dramatically.
And that raises a question. What will be the differentiator in that kind of environment? Because once price drops below a certain threshold, it's not just about cost. It's about reliability, patient support services, and even brand reputation.
Exactly. I think we're going to see companies invest more in patient engagement, support lines, adherence apps, injection training, things that go beyond the molecule itself. If you're one of 5 biosimilars competing for market share, Those wraparound services can be the deciding factor for both payers and providers.
So, if we pull back and look at the big picture, adoption isn't just a technical challenge, it's a behavioral challenge. It's about trust, education, and incentives, and every region is writing its own playbook.
One area we haven't really unpacked yet is the therapeutic categories driving biosimilar adoption. Oncology, for example, has been at the forefront. Drugs like rituximab, trastuzumab, and bevacizumab were massive blockbusters, and their biosimilars have already started reshaping treatment costs and access.
Yes, oncology is really the proving ground. When biosimilars for trastuzumab entered the market, the competition drove price reductions of nearly 30% in Europe. That's a huge shift for payers, and it made advanced cancer therapies more accessible to patients who previously couldn't afford them.
And ophthalmology is another fascinating case. Take ranibizumab. Biosimilars are coming to market for eye diseases like macular degeneration. Here, patient trust and physician comfort are even more critical because you're talking about injections directly into the eye. Companies are investing heavily in education and post market monitoring to show equivalence and build confidence.
Immunology has been equally important. Adalimumab, better known as Humira, has been the poster child in the US. The first wave of biosimilars launched in 2023, and we're now seeing how payers negotiate aggressively, sometimes preferring one biosimilar over another, while branded AbbVie still fights to maintain share through rebates.
And that creates a whole new landscape, biosimilar versus biosimilar competition, where payers use head to head bidding to push prices even lower. The question becomes, how sustainable is that for manufacturers? If margins shrink too much, do some players exit the market, leaving only a few dominant suppliers?
That's exactly the concern. We need competition for prices to fall, but if the economics don't work, we risk creating fragility in supply. Think of sterile injectables. When only a handful of suppliers exist, shortages become common. If the biosimilar space consolidates too far, we could see similar risks in biologics.
That's why resilience in manufacturing is so critical. Companies are experimenting with regionalized production and redundancy in supply chains to make sure patients don't experience interruptions. It's not just about low prices, it's about reliable access.
Another angle is payer strategy. In Europe, national tenders essentially force price competition. In the US, PBMS and insurers are experimenting with formulary designs that either incentivize or mandate biosimilar use. Brittany, from your perspective, how are payers shaping the future of biosimilars 2.0?
Great question. What I've seen is that payers are moving from being passive observers to active drivers of adoption. For example, outcomes based agreements are starting to appear in the biosimilar space. If a biosimilar doesn't deliver the expected outcomes in a given patient population, the payer gets a rebate. That not only lowers financial risk, but also builds payer confidence in newer entrants.
That's interesting because it shows biosimilars are becoming more than just a cost issue. They're also tied to value-based healthcare.
Exactly. And looking forward, the 2.0 moment might be when biosimilars stop being seen as copycats and start being seen as enablers of innovation. Lowering costs on existing biologics frees up budgets for newer therapies, including cell and gene therapies. It's a ripple effect.
And don't underestimate patient advocacy either. Patient groups are increasingly vocal about wanting access to biosimilars, especially in countries where biologics were previously out of reach. When patients push for more affordable options, regulators and policymakers listen.
So the competition in Biosimilars 2.0 isn't just between companies. It's a multi-stakeholder ecosystem. Payers, regulators, providers, and patients, all influencing how quickly these therapies become the standard of care.
As we bring this conversation to a close, one thing is clear. Biosimilars 2.0 aren't just a continuation of the first wave. They represent a new chapter in global healthcare. We've moved beyond simply proving that biosimilars can work. Now, the focus is on how they compete, how they're adopted, and how they reshape the economics of medicine.
Right? The next decade is going to be about balance. On one hand, we need aggressive price competition to unlock savings for health systems. On the other, we need sustainability so manufacturers can keep producing high-quality therapies without the constant threat of shortages.
And let's not forget patience. For all the business and regulatory conversations, biosimilars are about access. When a biologic drops in cost by 20, 30, even 40%, that's not just a financial statistic. It's more patients able to get the treatment they need. That's the ultimate measure of success.
The future will also hinge on innovation in how biosimilars are developed. Digital twins, AI enabled comparability studies, and new manufacturing platforms could lower development timelines and costs even further. That's when we start seeing smaller biotech firms enter the field, not just large players.
And globally, harmonization will be key. If every regulator requires a different data set, a different switching study, or a different dossier, biosimilars won't reach their full potential. But if agencies can align on standards, something groups like the WHO and ICH are pushing for, then we could see faster global launches and more equitable access worldwide.
One last thought from me: we shouldn't overlook education. Physicians, pharmacists, and patients all need to feel confident in biosimilars. When communication is clear, when the science is transparent, adoption grows naturally. The companies that invest in education and trust building will be the ones that lead this new wave.
Well said. So, whether you're a manufacturer, a payer, a regulator, or a patient advocate, Biosimilars 2.0 are shaping the future of healthcare affordability and sustainability.
And that's what makes this such an exciting space. It's not just about saving money, it's about reshaping healthcare systems so innovation and access can coexist.
Wrapping up today's episode of The Deep Dive. Brittany, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights. And it's been a great conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
If you want to learn more about how EMA International supports life sciences companies in navigating complex regulatory and market landscapes, you can visit us at emmainternational.com or reach us anytime at info@emmainternational.com.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive on Spotify and YouTube so you never miss an episode.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay innovative.